Now we're going to hear from Mark Weisbrot. And for those of you who don't know him, Mark Weisbrot is the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. And he has written numerous research papers on economic policy and is a widely cited expert on the IMF, having conducted extensive research on the impacts of their policies around the world, much of which is outside on the table if you didn't have a chance to get it on your way in. So Mark, he's going to share a PowerPoint.
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks to Petya for her presentation and for coming and agreeing to discuss these issues. I think they're very important, and I'm going to disagree, of course. But on what policy changes should be, not so much on the overall situation. Here's the IMF projections. I'll depart from this a lot, but I want to use some of the graphs and slides. So we have not only, as Petya said, a very fragile and uneven recovery, but also a recovery that is slowing according to the IMF projections. And so from 4.8% to this year to 4.2 for next year. That's the latest wheel. Now, the wheel itself also says that, as Petya pointed out, that private domestic demand is weak. It remains weak in many advanced countries. And, you know, the United States and Europe are, let me stick on this for a little bit, are half the world economy. So they have an enormous impact. And the U.S. economy is weak, is very weak, a very weak recovery right now. And, I mean, I'll just give a very quick couple of numbers. You know, we had an enormous housing bubble, probably $8 trillion of overvaluation. About $6 trillion of that has disappeared. And we had, you know, also a commercial real estate bubble, and we had a stock market drop as well. And combined, just by standard calculations based on the wealth effect, we would expect about $600 billion decline in private demand annually from that, and another $600 billion from the loss of construction, which is actual. Okay, so that's 1.2 trillion fall off in private spending in the economy from just the collapse of these bubbles. Now, the stimulus package that we had to counteract that the Congress passed, if you take off the state and local government spending, which goes in the other direction, and tax increases, and so you look at the net effect of government, you're talking about $150 billion a year for 2010 and 11. And so you have really 1/8 of the stimulus that you would need to counteract the fall off in private demand. So unless the dollar really crashes and we get a huge increase in net exports, we can talk about the WEO projections as the WEO Chapter 3 on the effects of fiscal consolidation. But unless something really, you know, like that happens, we're talking about a prolonged period, which, you know, of weak growth and very high unemployment. And of course, the CBO and both the CBO and the White House project prolonged high unemployment. So, you know, not getting back to pre-recession levels of unemployment until 2018 for the White House. These are enormous social costs. So we really should be careful about this, okay, when we're talking about a fragile and weak recovery. You know, Petya says, well, we can go back if it turns out to be worse than we think. Well, that's not always so easy. You know, recessions have a cumulative effect. And if we go back into recession, for example, it could be harder to get out of it. So I want to emphasize that. The U.S. economy is fragile. The Eurozone economy is slowly recovering and also fragile. And that is half the world economy. And so I think there's a contradiction between the WEO's overall outlook on the world economy and the advanced economies and the policy recommendations that we just heard. Let me go forward some more and take a look at this. Oh yes, I'm changing them. Okay, this is another quote, and this is what Petya already described, so I won't go into it, but one thing I will say is that I would take the second number that you used, the 1% cut fiscal consolidation leading to 1% of GDP rather than half, for the reason that you said. Everybody's not going to be increasing their exports at the same time. And if you're talking about the worst counter-cyclical cases, for example, the Eurozone, weaker Eurozone economies, they're stuck in the Euro, so there's nothing they can do in terms of trying to get out of, export their way out of the low growth. Now this study we did at the end of last year, and this just shows that you can hardly see it from there. I'm just going to pass over it quickly, but just to mention the main conclusion, where we looked at 41 agreements for the IMF these were the agreements made during the recession, 2008 and 2009. 31 out of 41 had either contractionary fiscal policy, or contractionary monetary policy, or both. And this was by a conservative measure of measuring the fiscal policy stance, because we were just we didn't have structural budget estimates. So in other words, normally you want to look at the you don't want to just look at what happens to the budget balance, because our deficit will increase, for example, because of automatic stabilizers. So you want to adjust for what the budget balance would be in full employment. And we didn't do that. So it's worse. The actual picture is worse than that. Now the question is, well, what's happening today? And these were major mistakes. And we went through this already with the IMF, and they have their answers, and you can see the whole debate. We put it all up on the web. But to be fair, I mean, the IMF did exactly what Petya talked about. Some of the agreements were made in 2008, and there were reviews for 2009, and they did change their policy recommendations and agreements, the policy in the agreement, their macro policy in the agreement. So the recession turned out to be a lot worse than they thought, which is exactly the risk that we're looking at going forward. Okay, and personally, I think they should have known. At that time, it was pretty obvious. Right now, we don't know. We know that there are a lot of downside risks, but it's not like in, these agreements that were being signed in 2008 when, the housing bubble had burst, and it looked like you knew that bad things were going to happen, and their projections for 11 out of these countries were more than 3 percentage points over optimistic. That's one of the ways in which the IMF ends up making these, inappropriate macroeconomic policies. They have over-optimistic projections. They say, oh, you can cut the budget, you can tighten monetary policy, because their growth estimates are way off. And by the way, again, in fairness to the fund, I want to say that all the criticism I'm making of the fund are really criticisms of their directors. Okay? I'm not blaming the fund or its economists in general, because they are run by the U.S. Treasury Department and with some input from Europe. And in some cases, the European governments are much harsher. In the case of Latvia, which I'm going to mention, the EU was clearly responsible for that mess, and more than the IMF. On the other hand, the IMF has quite a bit of influence, does research, and also provides funds and signs off on the agreements. So they have to be considered responsible, but it is their directors. And one caveat I'll make to that is that, since I already mentioned the U.S. economy, Olivier Blanchard, the chief economist of the IMF, was quoted in the newspapers yesterday, and whenever I see quotes in the newspapers, I always have to put another caveat in, because they're not always accurate. But if he did say what they said, that the United States does not need a further fiscal stimulus, that's something I'd love to have him in this room try and defend. Okay, given the actual numbers that we just went through, that this economy doesn't need another fiscal stimulus. I'm amazed that he could say that. I mean, even after his paper, the Rethinking Macroeconomics paper, which he published last February, where he, said, for example, and this is going to be relevant to what we're talking about, that central banks could possibly revise their targets from 2% to 3 or 4% inflation. So this is a major break for which he caught a lot of grief, break from orthodoxy, central bank orthodoxy, and I don't understand how the fund, and Petya, you're of course welcome to respond if you want to defend that statement, but this is really, in the world's largest economy, I think that's a very wrong belief. The other thing I think is really wrong is this focus on entitlements, you know, and this is very easy. So the IMF is saying, you know, in their WEO that you have to put forward, as Petya said, a credible long-term plan or intermediate-term plan for reducing, for fiscal consolidation, and part of this is reducing entitlements, raising retirement ages, and so on. And you know, of course, we have this deficit, this commission in the United States, which is going to look at the long-term deficit problem. And you know, this could be refuted in just 2 sentences for the United States. Number one, you know, well, at least 70% of our entire long-term deficit problem in the United States is just healthcare costs. Okay. And so, in other words, if you go to our website, you can plug in any other rich country's healthcare spending cost projections, and you see that the U.S. deficit eventually turns into a surplus. Okay, so this is the problem in the United States. It's not demographics. It's certainly not Social Security, which has a very small projected shortfall that is just not even a problem. And can be reconciled very easily, as it has in the past, with relatively small tax increases. And so this is, I think, a dangerous kind of view to put forward, that entitlements in the rich countries, and especially the United States, are the problem, or that there's other structural problems like that. Okay, let's go forward here. Now, these are actual pro-cyclical policies in which the fund is involved. They don't have agreements in all these countries, but they're involved, for example, in Spain and Portugal and Ireland as well with the European authorities. And these are countries that, you know, Hungary, okay, has slight positive growth, but the others are negative, and they are engaging in fiscal tightening, that is, cutting budgets, raising taxes. That is what we call pro-cyclical policies, the ones that Petya mentioned, that are guaranteed, as a matter of national income accounting, to push the economy further down. Okay? Now, that is, I think, just wrong. And again, Petya mentioned, well, there's maybe no choice. I want to argue that, in fact, there is a choice for all of these countries, and we'll get to that towards the end. But this, I think, is very wrong. Once you go down this path, you don't know where it's going to end. Latvia is the worst case. Well, we can take Greece first. I mean, just in order here. Here's the consolidation. This just shows their budget deficit being reduced. Okay, and this is a case where maybe they have too much debt. It may be that they need a restructuring. I mean, if the IMF projections turn out to be correct and their program works, Greece ends up with 144% of GDP debt just a few years from now, as opposed to, you know, they started out with 115. So this is not a program that seems workable to me. And if, in fact, as the markets believe, with a 75% probability that Greece is going to need a restructuring, well, then it's better to do it now than to make this country suffer for several years and suffer. I mean, you know, where do they get back to their pre-crisis level of output? Not even in 2015, and that's here's the IMF projections for Greece. Notice the difference between the October and the April WEO for Greece. Turned out to be a lot worse, huh? That's what happens a lot of times in these cases when you start to use pro-cyclical policies, because a lot of course, investment, consumer spending is psychologically affected, and you don't know, again, how far down it's going. The dotted blue line underneath is the most recent projections for Greece's negative economic growth, and the other one is the April. And, of course, there's the cost in terms of unemployment, not nearly as bad as we'll see some of the others. There's Greece. That's the inflation rate, which we can see inflation is not a problem at all, which is going to be important when we talk about alternatives. Ireland also, big fiscal consolidation, economy shrinking, again, unemployment rising from, you know, below 5 to around 13%. And again, they have deflation now. So there's another country that could very easily have expansionary fiscal policy, even paid for through central bank financing without any worries about inflation if there were monetary authorities who were willing to cooperate with that. Latvia is the worst. I want to emphasize this because this is a case, as I said, where the European authorities are worse than the fund. But this is a case where they lost, and this first one shows their fiscal consolidation taking place. The economy's already lost more than a quarter. The country's lost more than a quarter of its GDP. We still have projections that get them back to their pre-crisis level from the latest WEO, even after 2015. And look at their loss of output here. Look at the second to the bottom bar, over 25%. Worst, only thing comparable is the United States Great Depression years, 1929 to 33. This is in 2 years they lost that much, and they're still shrinking this year. Still no light at the end of the tunnel. Why? Because they're going through this process, again, which the European and the authorities and the IMF signed off on and provided billions of dollars for, where they're shrinking the economy in order to conduct what's called an internal devaluation. They want to keep the currency fixed, and they, in order to do that, they have to basically shrink the economy enough so that they become competitive on the basis of lower real wages and therefore a real devaluation with the nominal exchange rate fixed. A very brutal process, one that was tried with the same effect. You can see the next worst crisis there was Argentina, where they tried the same thing from 1998 to 2002 and ended in disaster. So again, these are examples of pro-cyclical policies that I think are really wrong. There's Latvia's unemployment rate, and they've lost probably 10% of their population. And people are just leaving the country because they can't find jobs. Again, lower negative inflation. Okay, Portugal, it's a similar story. I won't go through all of them. Romania, again, fiscal consolidation, while the economy is in recession. Well, it's barely growing. We saw 0.6. Here is Spain, which is going to shrink about 0.3% this year, also engaging in fiscal consolidation. Another mistake. And look at their unemployment, over 20%. Is there really nothing we can do about this? We actually did a paper where we looked at the possible alternatives. And you can see the baseline scenario. You can just see the arrow pointing to it. That's the IMF projections, and I'm sorry, that's the Central Bank of Spain projections for the debt to GDP ratio, and that's if, of course, everything works. If it doesn't work, then you have lower growth. They end up having to pay a higher interest rate because the markets don't really accept that they're adjusting fast enough. You have a much bigger, huge debt to GDP ratio. We did 2 other scenarios. One where you have a stimulus instead of cutting spending and raising taxes, and you see you only get 4 percentage points more of GDP, 4 percentage points of GDP debt at the end of 10 years than you would have under the consolidation scenario, which is not working very well right now. And then another scenario we had, which is the blue line at the bottom, which you end up with lower debt and, of course, much higher growth, where you finance it through the central bank if the ECB were to cooperate and do what the kind of things that the U.S. Central Bank is doing. Now, this is what I want to talk about because I think it's very important. These are the alternatives. They're not pie-in-the-sky alternatives. These are reasonable alternatives. What can you actually do in countries that don't want to accumulate more debt? Now, first of all, it's only net debt that matters. Okay, everybody should understand that. It's a little misleading if you read the press and all the discussion. They're almost always talking about gross debt. But if you have debt that is owed to the central bank, you're getting interest on that debt. It goes back to your treasury. Okay, In the United States, for example, because the Federal Reserve has created over $1 trillion since the recession started in money creation. Okay, they mostly bought mortgage-backed securities, but some of it was also buying federal government treasuries, and they could have bought all the treasuries. It has the same impact in terms of the money supply. And they get now, for 2010, the Congressional Budget Office projects that $77 billion will come back from the Federal Reserve back to the Treasury because of what they're holding. So that's about 37% of the net interest burden of the United States. It's a significant amount of interest. So you see, when the central bank owns the debt, the interest payments come back to you, to the taxpayers, to the budget. Okay? And so when you add that kind of debt, you have no additional debt burden. Japan, for example, has over 220% of GDP debt. That's their public debt. Now, over 100 percentage points of that are owed to the central bank. That's one reason why Japan doesn't have a fiscal crisis, in spite of having, you know, an enormously bigger debt than Greece. The other reason, of course, is they can borrow at 1% on a 10-year bond. But that's another part of the story. But the main part of the story is that they added literally trillions of dollars of public debt in the last 20 years by borrowing and financing it with their central bank. Everybody knows this. What was the impact of this on inflation? Well, inflation for the last 20 years in Japan, cumulative, not annual, but for the entire 20 years, prices have gone up 5%. Okay? So this does not lead to inflation. And it will not lead to inflation in the United States. There are people, and there are people I've talked to at the fund, who actually believe that the money created by the Fed in the last 2 years is going to suddenly lead to a burst of inflation. I will bet you large amounts of money that that will not happen, because it doesn't happen all at once. Okay, the Federal Reserve will be watching, and if in fact the inflation starts to pick up, long before it's appropriate, probably they will be tightening monetary policy. But in any case, it is not a threat, and you can see all the countries that we looked at. They all had low inflation or even negative inflation. They all have the option of, if they had a central bank that was willing to cooperate, of financing expansionary fiscal policy and doing it the same way by creating money the way the United States Federal Reserve did. Certainly the European countries could do that. Now, the problem, of course, is different for low and middle income countries, and I want to say a few words about that, because that's also part of the problem, right? Some of those are engaged in fiscal consolidation. Now, I didn't really spend any time on this because it was right at the beginning, and but for the low and middle income countries, you can see a lot of them represented here in this graph. Can you see it? These are all countries with IMF programs. You can't read them, but the majority of them are tightening. Okay? They're engaged in fiscal consolidation now, from 2009 to 2010. Now, I showed you that in the past, a lot of these were pro-cyclical policies. Most of these are no longer pro-cyclical. Some of them are. Okay? Why are they mostly not pro-cyclical anymore? Because these economies are rebounding, right? The emerging market, the developing low and middle income countries are mostly coming back. But that doesn't mean they necessarily have to tighten, they have to cut spending and raise taxes as much as they're doing. So they also will be facing problems, and especially if the world economy weakens. And so for the developing countries, and of course, if the rich countries, if the US and Europe follow the fiscal consolidation that some people are recommending, these countries will take a hit, just as they did during the last recession. So what can they do? And I just want to summarize this quickly because this also is often misunderstood. For the low and middle income countries that don't have a hard currency like the Eurozone or the United States or Japan, they can, in fact, engage in expansionary fiscal policies so long as they have enough foreign exchange. In other words, the real constraint for them is a foreign exchange constraint. When their economy grows, their imports grow, their current account balance can worsen, and they have to have enough foreign exchange to be able to do that. And in my view, the purpose of the IMF in these countries is to lend them the foreign exchange that they need so that they can do what the rich countries do when there's a downturn and not have to do what countries did in the 19th century when they're on the gold standard or something. Actually engage in pro-cyclical policies. And to its credit, the IMF actually created in 2009 $285 billion worth of its own reserve currency, the special drawing rights. And this was a very positive step. This gave countries more reserve. This is something the IMF could do again, and I think to help to at least provide some further liquidity to developing countries that need it. Okay, I will stop there. I think we've both taken about the same amount of time, and we can answer any questions. Thank you.